It was supposed to be a peaceful vacation. Cancun's sandy beaches, crystal clear blue waters, and luxurious resorts were a perfect escape from the hectic and often overwhelming everyday life they were used to. Emma and her friends had been counting down the days for this getaway for months. They had planned to spend the next few days sunbathing, sipping cocktails, and enjoying the paradise that Cancun seemed to offer. Nothing could go wrong. At least, that's what they thought. On the third day of their trip, with the bright sun beating down on them, they decided to take a break from the crowded beaches. They had heard rumors from the locals about a hidden gem deep in the jungles of Cancun, a place that few tourists had ventured into. It sounded thrilling, like the perfect adventure for their vacation. So, without a second thought, they booked a tour guide and set off toward the jungle. The tour started as any other, with the group laughing, taking pictures, and exchanging stories about their lives back home. Emma, always the one who was curious about the unknown, was eager to see a side of Cancun that not many people knew about. The jungle was an entirely different world, lush, green, and mysterious. The air was thick with humidity, and the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers filled their nostrils. But there was something about the jungle that felt off. It was quiet, too quiet. They had ventured for about 2 hours when the guide, an older man with a weathered face and a thick accent, pointed to a narrow trail veering off the main path. He had told them about it before, mentioning it casually as if it was no big deal. But Emma noticed the hesitation in his voice when he spoke of this trail. "This way, if you want to see something truly ancient," the guide said. "But don't expect much. It's just an old village, forgotten by time." Of course, Emma and her friends were too intrigued to turn back now. The group, filled with a sense of adventure and a touch of rebellion against the typical tourist traps, eagerly followed the guide down the narrow path. As they made their way deeper into the jungle, the sounds of nature seemed to become muffled, replaced by an eerie silence that crept into their bones. The leaves underfoot crunched with every step, the only noise breaking the silence. ... And yet it felt wrong, like the jungle was holding its breath. The further they went, the less the sunlight seemed to penetrate through the thick canopy of trees above. It was like they were entering a different world, one where the warmth of the sun and the cheerful sounds of Cancun no longer existed. As the path grew more difficult, Emma felt a strange sensation. It was like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a deep sense of foreboding, as if they were no longer welcome in this place. Then came the first sign of something unusual, a soft rustling in the bushes. The group froze. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't even the wind. The sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate. Emma's heart began to pound in her chest, but she quickly brushed it off, blaming it on her imagination. Her friends, however, didn't seem as unfazed. One of them, Sam, whispered, "Did anyone else hear that?" A guide turned around, his eyes narrowing, and held a finger to his lips. "Shh, Stay quiet. There are things out here, things that you don't want to disturb. Emma's curiosity piqued, but a part of her, the rational part, told her to be cautious. But it was too late to turn back now, so they continued on, pushing deeper into the jungle. The air felt colder, the shadows longer, as though the world itself had become more sinister. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they came across something unexpected. Hidden behind a thick wall of vines and trees was a small village. The sight of it struck Emma with a sense of unease, though she couldn't exactly say why. The village was small, with crumbling huts made from ancient stone and wood. The air around the place smelled off, like decay, like something long forgotten, something that shouldn't be there anymore.
"We're here," the guide said in a voice that was barely a whisper. "This is where you'll see what the jungle has kept hidden." The village looked as if it had been abandoned for years, maybe even decades. The roofs of the huts were caved in, and the walls were cracked and covered in moss. But what caught Emma's attention were the strange symbols etched into the stones of the huts. Symbols she had never seen before. Symbols that looked more like warnings than decorations. She couldn't stop herself from getting closer, and as she did, she noticed something even more unsettling. The ground beneath her feet was littered with old bones, some animal, others definitely human. The remains were scattered carelessly, as though whoever had left them behind didn't care enough to bury them. "We should go back," Emma said, her voice trembling. Something was wrong here. The feeling of dread in her chest was growing, and she couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. But her friends weren't ready to leave just yet. They had already come this far, and their curiosity was eating away at them. Sam, who had always been the brave one of the group, stepped forward, his eyes scanning the village with wide fascination. "Come on, Emma. It's just an old abandoned village. Probably nothing more than some old ruins. What's the harm in looking around?" Emma hesitated, but before she could argue, the guide muttered something under his breath, almost as if he was warning them. Then he abruptly turned around and began walking back down the path. "I'll wait for you here. You shouldn't stay too long." His sudden departure left Emma with a strange feeling, like he knew something they didn't. But her friends didn't seem to notice. They were already too busy exploring the village. Emma followed them reluctantly, stepping carefully around the bones and debris scattered across the ground. The deeper they went into the village, the more oppressive the air became. The trees around them seemed to grow thicker, closing in, as though the jungle itself was trying to trap them. The shadows from the fading light of day crept over everything, distorting the village into something that felt alive. Every creak of the wooden huts, every snap of a twig underfoot made Emma jump. Something wasn't right. Then, as Emma rounded a corner of a hut, she caught a glimpse of something that made her stomach churn. Behind one of the stone walls was a large symbol, painted in what appeared to be blood. It was an ancient, crude design, one that looked almost like an eye staring back at her. Suddenly, she heard the sound again, the rustling, the faint whispering. It was close now, just beyond the walls of the village. She could feel her heart racing in her chest. It wasn't just the wind. It wasn't an animal. There was something or someone out there.
Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned to call out to her friends. But before she could, a loud crash sounded from behind one of the huts. The group spun around, eyes wide, with shock. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered. They all nodded, in agreement, their faces pale. Something wasn't right, and they all knew it. "We should go now," Emma said again, her voice cracking. But it was too late to turn back now. The jungle was alive, and it wasn't letting them go that easily. As night began to settle over the jungle, the group of friends started preparing their camp. The daylight was slipping away, leaving the thick, oppressive darkness of the jungle to take over. Emma felt a strange tension in the air, an unspoken sense of urgency that she couldn't shake. They had been so focused on exploring, so wrapped up in the mysteries of the abandoned village, that they had pushed the strange feelings away. But now, as the last bit of sunlight faded behind the trees, the unease began to creep back into her bones. She glanced around, noticing how the dense jungle swallowed up any trace of light, leaving them in an almost unnatural darkness. Despite the discomfort she felt, Emma didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip for her friends. They were all too excited about their little adventure to consider turning back. So, with little more than a few awkward glances and half-hearted words of caution, they set up a small camp near the edge of the village. A few tents were quickly pitched, and a fire was started, crackling in the growing chill of the evening. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows on the trees, and the sound of the fire popping and crackling seemed to fill the air, distracting them from the silence that had descended around them. They laughed, told stories, and passed around a few drinks as they settled into their camp. The sounds of the jungle, which had earlier seemed strange and unsettling, were now just background noise to their conversation. But as the minutes ticked by and the darkness deepened, something shifted. The world around them grew eerily quiet. The chirping of insects and the calls of distant animals stopped, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Emma tried to brush off the growing sense of unease, but it gnawed at her. She couldn't stop glancing over her shoulder, convinced that the shadows were moving. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, pulsing louder than the crackling of the fire. Her friends didn't seem to notice. They were busy telling jokes, laughing, and carrying on as if nothing was wrong. But Emma knew something wasn't right. And it came. A low growl, distant but unmistakable. It sent a shiver down her spine. Emma froze, turning her head towards the sound. The growl seemed to reverberate through the trees, echoing through the thick air. It wasn't the growl of any animal she had ever heard before. It was deep, guttural, and wrong. It sounded like a beast, but it was unlike anything she had encountered. One of her friends, Sam, looked up from his phone where he had been scrolling through social media. "What was that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma strained to listen.
The growl had faded into the distance, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a rustling sound came from the underbrush, much closer this time. The sound was unmistakable, the snap of twigs, the soft shuffle of something moving through the leaves. The noise was deliberate, almost as if someone or something was trying to stay hidden. Emma's heart raced, her eyes darting around the campfire, searching the dark forest surrounding them. The others heard it too. They went silent, every one of them straining to hear the sound, but it was already gone. The forest had returned to its unsettling quiet, as though nothing had happened. But Emma wasn't convinced. She had heard it. She had felt it. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. "We should stay close," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling more than she intended. "There's something out there." Her friends just shrugged it off. "It's probably a wild animal," Sam replied. "Maybe a jaguar or something. They roam these parts." "That's what I thought too," Emma said, but her voice lacked conviction. It didn't feel like a wild animal. It felt different. Despite her unease, they didn't take her warnings seriously. They resumed their conversation, laughing again, trying to push the fear away. But Emma could see the nervous glances they exchanged. They were all just pretending everything was fine. Deep down, they were all beginning to feel it too. And then, out of nowhere, the air was filled with a sound that made Emma's blood run cold. It started as a low hum, almost like a distant whisper carried on the wind. But then it quickly grew into something more. It was chanting, ancient, eerie chanting. The words were foreign, their meaning lost to Emma, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't just the sound of a ritual. It was something more sinister. The chanting came from somewhere close, somewhere within the jungle, but there was no one to be seen. The sound seemed to vibrate in the air, twisting and pulsing, as if the very jungle itself was alive. It was as if the earth beneath them was breathing, sighing in response to the chants. The fire flickered, casting strange shadows against the trees, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw figures moving in the darkness at the edge of their camp. Figures dressed in tattered robes, their faces obscured by dark hoods. They were coming from the direction of the village. Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. Her friends stopped talking immediately, turning their attention to the sound, their faces etched with confusion and fear. Sam stood up, trying to peer into the darkness beyond the firelight. "It's just the wind," he said with a forced laugh, though there was no conviction in his voice. But Emma wasn't so sure. She could see movement now, just beyond the light of the fire. Figures. There were at least 5 of them, walking slowly, their robes swaying in the breeze, their heads tilted downward as if they were in some trance. The chanting grew louder, more intense, as the figures slowly made their way through the trees toward them. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, her voice rising in panic. But her friends didn't move. They were frozen, staring in disbelief at the figures that seemed to materialize out of the very shadows of the jungle. The figures walked closer, closer still, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't look at Emma. or her friends. They didn't even acknowledge their presence. They just continued to walk, their chanting growing louder, more hypnotic. Emma felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. There was something wrong with these figures. They weren't human, not in the way she understood it. Their faces were hidden by the hoods of their robes, but she could feel their eyes on her. It was as if they were watching her soul, not her body. She could barely breathe as the chanting intensified. The figures were now close enough for Emma to make out the strange symbols etched into their robes. Symbols that looked like they had been burned into the fabric, not sewn or stitched. Suddenly the figures stopped. They were mere feet away from the group now, and the air around them felt thick with an unspoken threat. The chanting ceased, but the silence that followed was worse than the sound. The figures stood still, their faces still hidden, but Emma could feel their gaze. They were watching them all, watching, waiting. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures turned and disappeared into the jungle. They moved so quickly, so silently, that it was as if they had melted into the shadows themselves. The jungle fell quiet again, but the oppressive feeling in the air remained. "What the hell was that?" Sam finally breathed, his voice shaky, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't think we're alone here." The fire crackled and popped, but its warmth seemed insignificant in the cold, suffocating darkness that surrounded them. Emma knew, deep down, that they had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They were in the jungle's grip now, and whatever had watched them would not forget. The morning light filtered through the thick canopy above, casting faint rays across the jungle floor. It was an uncomfortable kind of dawn, still and silent, the kind of morning where even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. Emma woke with a start, her heart pounding, still haunted by the events of the previous night. The figures, the chanting, the feeling of being watched, it had all felt too real. As she glanced around at her friends, huddled close to the fire they'd kept burning through the night, she could see that they were all on edge too. The laughter and carefree chatter of the day before seemed like a distant memory, replaced by an unspoken tension in the air. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Sam spoke up. "We need to leave. We're getting out of here." His voice was more serious than it had been the day before. The fear in his eyes was palpable. Emma agreed without a second thought. The jungle felt oppressive, suffocating. Last night's encounter with those hooded figures had left them all shaken, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them back to their camp. But despite their decision to leave, something pulled them back. A strange compulsion that none of them could explain. It was as though the jungle itself was calling to them, drawing them back to the village. The terror they had experienced wasn't enough to deter them. It was as though a thread had been woven between them and the ruins, an invisible force that wouldn't let them walk away. After a long and uneasy discussion, the group reluctantly agreed to return to the village. They didn't know why, but something inside each of them felt like they needed answers.
answers to the horrors they had witnessed, and the mystery of the village that had been abandoned for so long. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps it was just their minds trying to make sense of the madness they'd encountered. But whatever it was, they knew they couldn't leave without understanding more. The trek back to the village was quieter than before, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on their shoulders. Emma's heart raced as they approached the clearing where the village stood, the dense jungle creeping up around them like a living thing. It was as if the place itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to enter. As they walked through the broken village, everything seemed to be the same as before. Old, dilapidated huts covered in moss and vines, walls marked with strange symbols, and the faint smell of decay hanging in the air. The eerie quiet from last night still lingered, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was almost as if the place had a pulse, a heartbeat that she could feel in her bones. But they pressed on, moving deeper into the village, their steps slow and cautious. As they explored, they came across something they hadn't seen the day before, a large stone structure, half buried in the dirt. It was an altar, ancient and weathered by time, its surface cracked and stained with what could only be blood. The sight of it sent a chill down Emma's spine, and she instinctively stepped back, as if the altar itself was alive, waiting for something. Sam, however, seemed determined to investigate. He stepped forward, his fingers brushing against the rough stone surface. His eyes narrowed as he studied the altar, the bloodstains that marred its surface, the strange carvings that adorned its edges. "What the hell happened here?" he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. Emma felt a lump form in her throat, her body tensing as she glanced around the village, expecting to see something move in the shadows. She could feel her skin crawling, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the jungle pressing down on them. Suddenly, as Sam examined the altar, something caught his attention. There, hidden beneath the stone, was a small, tattered journal. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. He carefully lifted it from its hiding place, brushing the dust off the cover before opening it with shaking hands. Emma couldn't help but lean in closer, her curiosity outweighing the growing sense of dread that had settled in her chest. As Sam flicked through the pages, the group gathered around, peering over his shoulder. The journal was filled with strange, cryptic writing, written in a language none of them could recognize. But there were drawings, too, rough sketches of people, faces twisted in terror, their bodies bound to the altar, and at the center of the sketches always the same, an enormous figure, monstrous and dark, looming over the sacrifices, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. A journal was a record of rituals, each one more horrifying than the last. It told the story of an ancient cult that had once thrived in the jungle, a cult that had worshipped dark, twisted gods. The cult believed that by consuming human flesh, they could attain immortality. By feasting on the souls of the living, they would be granted eternal life, free from death's grasp.
The journal spoke of brutal ceremonies where the cult would capture travelers, drag them to the village, and sacrifice them in twisted rites, their bodies consumed by the cultists in a horrifying feast. Emma felt the color drain from her face as she read the chilling accounts. The details were graphic, too graphic to even comprehend. The cult's members had believed that the gods required blood, that their immortality could only be attained by offering the purest form of sacrifice, human life. And so, they had made it their practice to hunt down anyone who ventured too far into the jungle, dragging them back to the village where they would be bound, tortured, and ultimately eaten alive. The journal went on to describe the specific rituals, the chants, the symbols, the sacred stones, and how the cultists had performed their ceremonies under the cover of night, hidden away from the prying eyes of the outside world. The chilling part was that according to the journal, the cult had once numbered in the hundreds, but over time, their numbers had dwindled, either due to outside interference or the growing fear that their gods were displeased. Yet, the rituals have never stopped. Even as the village decayed and time wore on, the cult had continued its dark practices, keeping the tradition alive in secret, hidden deep in the jungle. But it was the last entry that truly terrified Emma. The writing was frenzied, the ink smudged in places as if the writer had been rushed, desperate. The entry was short, but it sent a cold shiver down Emma's spine. They are coming for us. No one ever leaves this place. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, the final cry of a desperate soul who had seen what lay ahead and knew there was no escape. Emma felt a sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting. Her vision blurred for a moment as the weight of the journal's contents settled in her mind. This wasn't just a story of the past. This was real. The cult had never left. They had only waited, hidden in the shadows, watching and biding their time. As the group stood there in stunned silence, Emma's stomach churned. The horrors described in the journal were no longer confined to the pages. They were real, and they were still here, somewhere in the jungle, waiting for the next sacrifice. "We need to go," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. But even as the words left her lips, she knew it was too late. The jungle had claimed them, and there was no escaping it now. The sound of rustling leaves reached their ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she realized with growing horror that they were no longer alone. Something, or someone, was watching them. As Emma's voice quivered, the last words of the journal echoing in her mind, a horrifying noise suddenly shattered the uneasy silence. It wasn't the rustle of leaves in the wind. The sound was sharp. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The world felt impossibly still, as if the jungle itself had taken a breath, waiting for what came next. But that moment was short-lived. Panic surged through Emma's veins, her pulse quickening. The heavy sound of footsteps was growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't something natural. These steps were human, were something that mimicked them. "Run!" Sam shouted, his voice raw with fear. Without another word, they all turned and bolted into the jungle, their bodies moving on pure instinct.
Emma's feet pounded against the uneven ground, her body reacting faster than her mind. Branches scratched her arms and face as she pushed through the thick undergrowth, but she didn't feel it. Her only focus was on getting away, on escaping whatever was behind them. Her heart hammered against her chest as her breath became a shallow, desperate gasp. The jungle, once beautiful and serene, had now turned into a maze of shadows and twisted trees, each turn feeling like it led them deeper into danger. A noise of their hurried footsteps mixed with the eerie, rhythmic chanting that now filled the air. The chanting, low and guttural, seemed to wrap itself around them, pressing in from every direction. It wasn't coming from one place anymore. It was all around them, as though the cultists were spreading out, surrounding them. The fear in Emma's chest tightened like a vice. No matter how fast they ran, it felt as if the jungle was swallowing them whole, pulling them deeper into its dark embrace. "Where are we going?" Sam yelled, his voice cracking with terror. "I don't know," Emma screamed back, her voice lost in the cacophony of sound. "Just keep running." But it didn't matter how fast they ran. No matter how hard they pushed their bodies, they were always just a step away from being caught. The jungle stretched endlessly before them, the trees closing in tighter, their branches seeming to reach out, grasping at them. And every time Emma glanced back, she saw it. The shadows. The cultists, their figures, draped in tattered robes, flitted between the trees like phantoms. At first, Emma thought it was just the blur of motion in the corners of her vision, but no, there was something tangible about them. They weren't just hiding in the darkness, they were moving deliberately, closing the gap between them. Their chanting grew louder with every step, echoing off the trees, filling Emma's mind with an overwhelming sense of dread. They were getting closer, faster. "Sam!" Emma screamed, but the words were lost in the wind. Her legs were burning, every breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. She tried to push herself harder, but her limbs were beginning to feel like lead. The ground beneath her feet was uneven, rocks and roots tripping her up, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. Suddenly, her foot caught on something, and before she could react, she tumbled forward, hitting the ground hard. The force of the fall knocked the breath out of her chest, and for a moment, she could only lie there, gasping for air, her vision blurred, the sounds of the jungle swirling around her in a disorienting frenzy. It was then she heard the whispers, the low voices of the cultists, their words coming from all around her. She struggled to sit up, her body trembling as she pushed herself onto her knees. The jungle had become a maze, a twisted labyrinth designed to trap them. The chanting was louder now, more insistent, and Emma's heart raced as the terrifying realization hit her. She was alone. She had lost the others in the chaos, separated in the darkness of the jungle.
Emma's breath quickened, panic setting in as she scanned the trees. The shadows danced between the trunks, and the flickering light of the fire from their camp was barely visible in the distance. There was no way to tell where the others were. They were scattered, each of them running for their lives. But the jungle had already begun to close in around them. A low growl echoed through the trees, and Emma froze. It wasn't the same growl as before. This one was closer, more deliberate, and filled with malice. Her blood ran cold. She could hear the thudding of footsteps again, but they were no longer distant. They were right behind her. Emma's eyes darted around, desperately searching for some sign of escape. But it was hopeless. The jungle had turned against her. And then, through the trees, she saw them. The figures, hooded, their faces hidden beneath the dark folds of their robes, moved with a chilling grace, gliding through the forest like ghosts. Their movements were unnatural, almost predatory. The chanting continued, rising in volume, growing more frenzied. Emma's heart stopped as the figures stopped in front of her, encircling her in an almost ritualistic formation. They weren't just following her. They were hunting her. The hooded figures moved slowly, their eyes now visible, glowing with an unnatural hunger. Their faces were gaunt, twisted, hollow-eyed, and Emma could see the deep, sunken pits of their cheeks, the sharp bones protruding from their skin. They weren't human anymore, not in any sense Emma recognized. These were something else. Their eyes, if you could call them that, were empty, devoid of any emotion except for one: hunger.
Emma's throat went dry as one of the figures stepped forward. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as it moved closer. The chant shifted in tone, becoming an almost hypnotic rhythm. The words were foreign, alien, but the meaning was clear. They were calling to something. They were summoning something darker. The fear coursing through Emma's body reached a crescendo as she realized that this was no longer a chase. It was a ritual. The figure reached out, a bony hand. Its fingers gnarled and twisted like tree roots. Emma's blood ran cold as she scrambled backward, her hands pressing into the dirt for leverage. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The shadows seemed to reach for her, closing in tighter with every step she took. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the trees. A figure darted out from behind a cluster of vines, and Emma's heart leaped in her chest. It was Sam. "Emma!" he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But before he could take another step, one of the cultists lunged toward him, its arms outstretched. "No!" Emma cried, her voice hoarse. She tried to push herself to her feet, but the ground was treacherous, and her legs were giving out. Everything was happening too fast, too violently. Sam's struggle with the cultist was brief, a blur of motion, and then another figure grabbed hold of him, pulling him into the darkness. Emma's scream echoed through the trees, but it was swallowed by the jungle's suffocating silence. They were gone.
The cultists were closing in on her now, their faces twisted with malice. The shadows seemed to encircle her, and Emma knew there was no escape. They had her. The jungle had won. And then everything went dark. Emma's body shook with exhaustion and fear, her muscles burning as she fought against the overwhelming panic that threatened to choke her. The jungle, now a place of nightmares, had swallowed her whole. The constant chanting, the haunting figures, the sense of being hunted. It was all too much. She was trapped. There was no escape. No one was coming to seize her. But somehow, in the midst of the terror, she knew one thing. She had to survive. The cultists were closing in, their eyes burning with hunger, and the air around her felt heavier with every passing second. They weren't in a rush anymore. They had her exactly where they wanted her. Their slow, deliberate steps made it clear. They were savoring the moment. Emma could feel the oppressive weight of their gaze as they encircled her, like a pack of predators moving in for the kill. The leader, who had been standing at the back, now stepped forward. His face was pale, almost sickly, and it was covered in strange tattoos that seemed to writhe with life, shifting across his skin like some dark, twisted pattern. His eyes, hollow and full of malicious intent, locked onto hers. Without a word, the leader began to speak, his voice low and guttural. The language was foreign, incomprehensible. It was a sound that seemed to crawl under her skin, as though the words themselves carried with them a curse. Emma couldn't understand what he was saying, but the tone was unmistakable. There was no mistaking the meaning behind his voice. He was speaking to her alone. He was the one in charge. And as his eyes gleamed with cruel delight, Emma realized what was happening. She was about to be the next sacrifice. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat louder than the last. She could feel the adrenaline surge through her veins, making her head spin. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, her thoughts racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by the crushing realization that there was no way out. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. She couldn't just stand there, waiting for them to drag her to that dark altar, to become nothing more than another corpse for them to feast upon. She wasn't going to die here, not like this, not without a fight. With trembling hands, she scanned the ground around her, desperate for anything that could give her an advantage. Her eyes darted across the tangled underbrush, the gnarled roots, and the thick, wet earth. And then she saw it, a sharp rock, jagged and cruel, just within reach. It was the only thing between her and certain death. Her hand shot out, gripping the rock tightly. The cold, hard surface felt like a lifeline in her hand, a weapon, a chance. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The leader of the cult took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The other cultists stood silently, waiting. There was no more chanting now, just the sound of her rapid, panicked breathing, filling the space between them. Emma's mind raced. She could see the terror in the eyes of her friends from earlier. their faces still haunting her memories. She could almost hear their screams, the sound of their struggles, and she knew she couldn't let that happen to her. The leader raised his hand, signaling to the others. The cultists slowly, deliberately began to close the distance. They were moving in for the kill, their hands reaching out, their eyes glowing with an insatiable hunger. Emma could almost hear the blood pounding in her ears, the sound of her heartbeat, steady but faint.
Without warning, she lunged. Her body moved on instinct, desperation driving her every action. The sharp rock in her hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but she used every ounce of strength in her body to drive it into the leader's chest. The impact was immediate. The leader staggered back with a sharp, guttural cry, his hands flying to his chest as the blood began to pour from the wound. Emma's hands were soaked, the warmth of it splattering across her face and arms. But she didn't stop. She didn't care. She had to get out. She had to survive. For a split second, the cultists hesitated. It was a brief moment of shock, a flicker of doubt that ran through them, but it was enough. Emma took that moment and ran. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she stopped now, it would be the end. Her legs burned as she sprinted through the dense jungle, branches slapping at her face, the thick underbrush threatening to trip her up with every step. She could still hear the leader's screams echoing in her ears, the sound of his blood dripping onto the ground, the cultists' footsteps following closely behind. They were coming for her, but she wasn't going to make it easy. The jungle was a maze, a twisted labyrinth of trees, vines, and shadows. But Emma didn't care. She pushed forward, her breath ragged and desperate, her legs moving faster than she thought possible. She had to keep going. She had to keep running. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear them. The cultists weren't far behind. Their chanting had started again, growing louder and louder with each passing second, like a drumbeat that echoed through the trees, urging them forward. Emma's heart pounded in time with the chant, the rhythm of it suffocating, pressing in on her chest like a vice. She stumbled once, her foot catching on a root, but she quickly recovered, her hand reaching out to steady herself against a tree. Sweat dripped down her forehead, her body covered in dirt and blood. Her vision blurred with fatigue, but she refused to stop. Every step felt like a victory. Every breath was a defiance against the darkness that was chasing her. The trees were beginning to thin out, the jungle opening up into a clearing. Emma could see the light of the setting sun in the distance, the faint orange glow just beyond the trees. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the sharp pain in her side, the way her lungs screamed for air. The clearing was so close. It was her only hope. But just as she thought she might make it, the cultists appeared, emerging from the shadows like specters. The leader, bloodied but still alive, was at the front, his eyes burning with fury. The others flanked him, their faces twisted in cruel anticipation. They had caught up to her. Emma's heart sank. She was cornered. There was nowhere left to run. But in that moment, she felt something else. A surge of power, an overwhelming will to survive. She wasn't going to die here. Not today. With a final burst of strength, she turned and ran directly at them, her feet pounding the ground like thunder. Her mind screamed with panic, but she wasn't going to be their prey. She wasn't going to be sacrificed. She reached for anything she could grab. Branches, rocks, anything that could help her fight. And as the first cultist reached out to grab her, Emma swung with all her might, her hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The fight for her life had only just begun. It felt like an eternity had passed. Emma's legs, numb from exhaustion, barely carried her forward as she stumbled through the thick undergrowth of the jungle. Her clothes were torn, her skin scratched and bruised from the relentless branches and thorns that had whipped at her as she ran. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was still alive. She had made it out. The nightmare that had consumed her for what seemed like forever was over, but the horrors would never leave her. The dense canopy of the jungle had begun to thin, and Emma could see the faint outline of the jungle's edge. A small clearing, an opening to the outside world. She pushed forward, each step a desperate attempt.
Finally, after what felt like hours of stumbling through the dense forest, she broke free. She emerged from the jungle and stumbled onto the familiar path. The hard ground beneath her feet feeling like a strange relief. The sun was beginning to set in the distance, casting long shadows across the landscape. The familiar sight of the outside world was like a cruel reminder of everything she had been through. She collapsed to the ground, her hands bracing herself as her knees buckled. She let the tears fall, her face streaked with dirt and blood. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She was alive, yes, but that didn't mean she had escaped the darkness. The images from the jungle, the chanting, the cultists, the twisted faces that haunted her every thought, still clung to her mind like a persistent nightmare. She couldn't shake them, no matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she tried to forget. The horrors she had witnessed would never leave her. She sat there for a moment, gathering her bearings, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her body trembled as the adrenaline slowly wore off, leaving her drained and weak. She could barely process the fact that she had just escaped a nightmare, that she had somehow survived when so many others hadn't. But there was no time to dwell on that. She had to keep moving. She had to get back to civilization. She stood, her legs unsteady beneath her, as she glanced around. There was no sign of her friends. The last she had seen them, they had been scattered in the chaos, each of them running for their lives as the cultists closed in. Emma's heart tightened with guilt and fear as the thought crossed her mind. Were they still alive? Were they caught by the cultists? Or had they suffered the same fate as the others before them? She forced the thought away. She couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. She needed to get out, to find help, and to get back to safety. She could come back for them later, if they were still alive. But for now, she had to focus on her own survival. With a final glance at the jungle behind her, Emma turned and made her way down the narrow path that would eventually lead her back to the nearest town. Her steps were slow, hesitant at first, but they gradually gained strength as she found her rhythm. The familiar sights and sounds of the outside world, distant birds calling, the rustling of the wind through the trees, felt almost foreign to her after the terror she had endured. The sounds that used to comfort her now felt strange, alien. As she walked, her thoughts turned to the cult. The images of the hooded figures, their hollow eyes, and their insatiable hunger for death were burned into her memory. She couldn't escape them. The journal, the ancient rituals, the bloodstains on the altar, it was all too much to comprehend. The fear, the brutality, the sheer evil of it all. It had left an indelible mark on her. She would never forget what she had seen. Never forget the faces of the people who had been sacrificed, their screams echoing in her mind, their final moments of terror seared into her memory. She could still hear the chanting, faint but persistent, like a distant echo that refused to fade. It wasn't just in her head. She knew it wasn't. There were times when the wind howled just right, or when the night was especially still, that she swore she could hear it calling to her. The familiar rhythm of those haunting voices, beckoning her back to the place where it all began. The jungle had claimed her once, and it would never truly let her go. Days passed as Emma made her way back to civilization. She moved through the towns and villages, her face hidden beneath the hood of her jacket, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might question her. She didn't have the strength to explain what had happened, nor the words to do so. She didn't know how to tell anyone what she had witnessed, how to describe the things she had seen in that jungle, the things she had fought against. It was as if no one would ever truly understand, and perhaps no one would believe her. How could they? Who could believe a story like hers? She spent the next few weeks in a daze, going through the motions of daily life like a ghost. She couldn't shake the images of the cultists, their hollow eyes and their twisted faces. They lingered in her thoughts, haunting her every waking moment. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them, standing in the darkness, waiting. She could still hear their chanting, the hypnotic rhythm of it pulsing in her ears. Even when she was wide awake, it followed her wherever she went. Emma tried to block it out. She tried to push it all to the back of her mind, to move on and pretend that she had left it behind in the jungle. But the nightmares came every night, more vivid than the last. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the sounds of the jungle still echoing in her ears. And sometimes, in the silence of the night, when the wind howled just right, she swore she could hear the chanting once more. It was always the same, the call of the jungle beckoning her back. She knew she could never escape it. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, the jungle would always be with her. She had seen too much. She had become part of its story, part of its dark history. She would never be the same again.